The bride froze mid-step, her white gown pooling around her feet like morning clouds. The wedding march continued playing, but she no longer heard it. Every guest in the garden turned to stare, confused by the sudden halt in the procession. Her eyes were fixed on a figure standing at the back of the crowd, a weathered old man in clothes that did not belong at a ceremony this elegant. He had been whispering something, a melody so faint it should have been lost beneath the music and the murmur of 200 guests. But she had heard it. She had heard it because she had spent 30 years listening for it in her dreams. "Hush now, my darling, the stars hold you tight. Daddy will find you by morning's first light." The bouquet slipped from her trembling fingers and scattered roses across the white carpet. "Daddy?" If this story reminds you that love never truly dies, comment "forever" below. Margaret Chen had been 3 years old when her father deployed for the last time. She remembered fragments from that morning, scattered images that had grown softer with each passing decade. The roughness of his uniform against her cheek, the smell of coffee and aftershave, the way he had knelt before her and pressed his forehead to hers, the way he always did when he was about to leave. And the song, the lullaby he had sung to her every night since she was born, and again every morning before every deployment. It was their ritual, their promise, their secret language that meant he would always come home. Except he never did. 3 months after that final deployment, 2 officers had arrived at their door in dress uniforms. They had spoken to her mother in quiet voices, while Margaret played with blocks on the living room floor. Too young to understand the words, but old enough to feel the world shifting beneath her. Master Sergeant David Chen had been killed in action during a classified operation. His body had not been recovered. There would be a memorial service. There would be a flag. There would be a lifetime of absence where her father should have been. The years that followed had been defined by that absence. Margaret's mother had remarried when Margaret was 7 to a kind man named Richard, who had tried his best to fill an unfillable void. He had attended her school plays and taught her to ride a bicycle and walked her down the aisle at her high school graduation. He had been a good stepfather, patient and present and genuine in his affection. But he was not her father. He did not know the lullaby. He did not know about the forehead touches, or the way David Chen had called her his little starlight, or the promise that had been broken on a battlefield half a world away. Margaret had grown into a successful woman, despite the fracture at her foundation. She had graduated from law school, built a career as a prosecutor, and found love with a man named James, who understood that part of her heart would always belong to a ghost. When James proposed, she had said yes, with tears in her eyes, thinking of the father who would never see her wedding day. She had asked Richard to walk her down the aisle, and he had accepted with quiet grace, understanding the honour and the complexity of what she was asking. The wedding had been planned for 18 months, a garden ceremony at a historic estate outside of Boston, with 200 guests and enough flowers to fill a greenhouse. Margaret had chosen every detail with meticulous care, from the vintage lace of her gown to the specific shade of blush on the roses in her bouquet. She had also chosen to leave an empty chair in the front row, draped with her father's folded flag and a photograph from his last deployment. It was her way of including him, her way of acknowledging that even after 30 years, the man who had sung her to sleep still occupied a place in her heart that no one else could touch. What she did not know, what no one knew, was that David Chen was not dead. He had never been dead, and he was standing 60 feet away, watching his daughter prepare to marry a man she loved, wondering if he had the right to shatter the life she had built on the foundation of his absence. The truth of what had happened to Master Sergeant David Chen was buried in classified files that would not be declassified for another 50 years. The official story, the one told to his wife and daughter, and recorded in military databases, was that he had been killed during a covert operation in a country the United States was not officially operating in. The reality was far more complicated. David had survived the mission, but just barely. He had been captured by enemy forces and held for 7 months in conditions that defied description. When he finally escaped, making his way across hostile territory to a friendly border, he had been a different man. The physical wounds had healed, but the psychological damage was profound. He could not remember his own name for the first 3 weeks after his rescue. He could not remember his wife's face or his daughter's voice. The military doctors called it severe dissociative amnesia, triggered by trauma so extreme that his mind had simply locked away everything that came before. He was given a new identity for security reasons, placed in a rehabilitation facility, and essentially forgotten by the system that had created him. The memories came back slowly over the following years. Fragments at first, like shards of a broken mirror, reflecting pieces of a life that no longer existed. He remembered the smell of his daughter's hair. He remembered the sound of his wife's laughter. He remembered the lullaby, though it took him 2 years to remember why it mattered. By the time his mind had healed enough to understand what he had lost, a decade had passed. His wife had remarried. His daughter had grown into a teenager who had mourned him and moved on. He had watched them from a distance, using skills the military had taught him to remain invisible, and he had made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He decided not to go back, not because he did not love them. He loved them with every fractured piece of his broken heart. But he had seen the life they had built without him, the stability, the healing, the new family that had formed in the crater of his absence. He convinced himself that returning would only cause more pain, that he was too damaged, too different, too much of a ghost to ever be a real father or husband again. So he had disappeared into the margins of society, living under a false name, taking odd jobs when his body allowed, and spending the rest of his time watching his daughter grow up from the shadows. He had been there when she graduated from high school, standing at the back of the auditorium in clothes borrowed from a shelter. He had been there when she graduated from law school, crying silently in the last row while her mother and stepfather cheered from the front. He had been there for her first big case, sitting in the public gallery of the courtroom, bursting with pride that he could never express. And now he was here, at her wedding, because he could not bear to miss the most important day of her life. He had planned to stay invisible, as he always did. He had found a spot at the back of the crowd, where the garden's rose bushes provided partial cover. He had dressed in the cleanest clothes he could find, though they still marked him as someone who did not belong among these elegant guests. He had promised himself he would not make a sound, would not draw attention, would not do anything to disturb the perfect day his daughter deserved. But when she had appeared at the end of the aisle, radiant in white, looking so much like her mother had looked on their wedding day 33 years ago, something inside him had broken open. The lullaby had escaped his lips before he could stop it, a whisper so soft it should have been lost in the music. But somehow, impossibly, she had heard. The moment stretched into eternity. Margaret stood frozen on the white carpet, her eyes locked on the old man at the back of the crowd. The wedding march stuttered to a halt as the string quartet noticed the disruption. 200 guests turned in their seats, following the bride's gaze to the weathered figure who stood alone among the rose bushes. Richard, who had been waiting to take Margaret's arm, stepped forward with concern. "Margaret? Sweetheart, what's wrong?" But Margaret did not hear him. She was moving before she realised she had made the decision to move, her gown trailing behind her as she walked back up the aisle in the wrong direction, toward the old man who had not moved, whose face was streaming with tears, whose lips were still forming the words of a song she had carried in her heart for 3 decades. The crowd parted before her in confusion. She walked past aunts and uncles and college friends and colleagues, past people who loved her and people she barely knew, past everything that had defined her adult life, toward the impossible truth standing at the edge of her wedding. She stopped 3 feet away from him. Up close, she could see the resemblance that 30 years of hardship had obscured. The shape of his eyes, the line of his jaw beneath the unkempt beard, the way he held his shoulders, military straight despite the weight of invisible burdens. "Sing it again," she whispered. Her voice was trembling, barely audible even in the hushed silence that had fallen over the garden. "Please, sing it again." David Chen looked at his daughter, at the woman she had become, at the child he had left behind, and he sang. His voice cracked on the first note, rough from years of disuse and thick with emotion, but the melody was unmistakable. "Hush now, my darling. The stars hold you tight. Daddy will find you by morning's first light. Sleep through the darkness, dream of the dawn. When you awake, love, I won't be gone." Margaret's knees buckled. She would have fallen if the old man had not caught her, his arms wrapping around her with a strength that belied his fragile appearance. She pressed her face into his chest and sobbed. 30 years of grief and longing and unanswered questions pouring out of her in a flood that no dam could contain. "Daddy," she kept saying, over and over, the word a prayer and an accusation and a homecoming all at once. "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy." The wedding guests sat in stunned silence as the story emerged in fragments over the following hour. The ceremony was paused, not cancelled, as Margaret refused to let go of her father's hand for even a moment. James, the groom, approached with a grace that confirmed Margaret had chosen well. He introduced himself to his future father-in-law with a firm handshake and eyes that held no judgment, only compassion. Richard, the stepfather who had loved Margaret as his own for 23 years, stood back with tears in his eyes, understanding that this moment was not about him, and finding peace in that understanding. Margaret's mother Elizabeth had to be helped to a chair when she saw the man she had mourned for 3 decades standing in her daughter's embrace. The recognition came slowly, fighting through the changes that time and trauma had wrought, but when it came, it was absolute. She had spent 30 years believing she had buried her heart in an empty grave. Now that heart was beating again, damaged and weathered but alive, standing in a garden full of roses on their daughter's wedding day. The explanations came later, in a private room at the estate where the reception was supposed to have begun. David told his story in halting sentences, each word dragged up from depths he had kept sealed for decades. The capture, the torture, the amnesia that had stolen his identity for years, the slow recovery, the decision, wrong in retrospect but made with love, to stay away rather than disrupt the lives that had healed without him. He told them about the years of watching from the shadows, about the pride he had felt in Margaret's accomplishments, about the 1,000 times he had almost approached, and the 1,000 reasons he had convinced himself not to. Margaret listened with her hand gripping his, her wedding makeup ruined by tears that would not stop flowing. When he finished, she did not offer forgiveness, because forgiveness implied wrongdoing, and she was not yet sure what she felt. What she offered instead was something simpler and more profound. "You're here now," she said. "You're here, and you're alive, and I'm getting married today. Will you walk me down the aisle?" David looked at Richard, the man who had raised his daughter, who had earned the right to that honour through 23 years of patient, present love. "I couldn't take that from him," he said. "He's been your father in all the ways that matter." Richard stepped forward then, this kind man who had never tried to replace a ghost, and he said the words that would define the rest of David's life. "She has 2 fathers who love her. I think she should walk down the aisle with both of us." The wedding ceremony resumed an hour later, restructured to accommodate a miracle. The string quartet played a different song this time, one that Margaret had chosen in the moment, a simple melody that echoed the lullaby her father had sung. She walked down the aisle with a man on each arm, Richard on her left and David on her right. 2 fathers who had loved her in different ways across the divided chapters of her life. The guests rose as she passed, many of them crying openly at the sight of this impossible family made whole. At the altar, both men kissed her cheek before taking their seats, Richard in the front row beside Elizabeth, and David in the chair that had been draped with his flag and photograph, which now sat folded in his lap like a chapter finally closed. The ceremony itself was brief but profound. James and Margaret exchanged vows that had been written before this day's revelations, but seemed to carry new weight in their aftermath. They spoke of love that endures, of finding each other against impossible odds, of building a life that could weather any storm. When the officiant pronounced them married, the applause that erupted was not just for the couple, but for the family that had been restored, for the miracle that had unfolded in the middle of a garden on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. The reception became something more than a celebration of marriage. It became a homecoming, a reunion, a reckoning with the past, and a toast to the future. David sat at the head table with his daughter and her new husband, still wearing the worn clothes that marked him as an outsider, refusing all offers of something more appropriate. "This is who I am now," he told Margaret, when she suggested he might be more comfortable in something else. "This is who you're getting back. I won't pretend to be something I'm not." The speeches that followed were unlike any wedding speeches ever given. Richard spoke about the privilege of raising Margaret, about the love he had for a daughter who was not his by blood, but was his in every way that mattered. He spoke about David, about the letters Margaret had written to her dead father as a child, about the empty chair at school events and the candle lit every year on the anniversary of his supposed death. And then David himself stood, unplanned, unprepared, and spoke for the first time to the family he had left behind. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not make excuses. He simply told them that watching Margaret grow up from the shadows had been both the greatest privilege and the deepest agony of his life. That he had been wrong to stay away. That he would spend whatever years he had left earning the right to be called her father again. The months that followed were not easy. 30 years of absence could not be bridged by a single miraculous day. There were difficult conversations and painful revelations. There was therapy, both individual and family, as they all learned to navigate a reality that none of them had ever imagined. David moved into a small apartment near Margaret and James's home, funded by back pay and benefits that the military owed him for decades of classified limbo. He received proper medical care for the first time in years, treatment for the physical ailments that had accumulated through decades of hard living. More importantly, he received treatment for the psychological wounds that had never properly healed, the trauma that had driven him into the shadows in the first place. Elizabeth, Margaret's mother, did not reconcile with David in any romantic sense. Too much time had passed, too much life had been lived separately. But she found a kind of peace in knowing that the man she had loved and mourned was alive, and she welcomed him as a co-parent to the daughter they had created together. Richard, the stepfather, became something like a brother to David, two men bound by their shared love for the same remarkable woman. They had Sunday dinners together, the whole complicated family gathered around a table that should not have existed, giving thanks for the impossible. 1 year after the wedding, Margaret gave birth to a daughter. She named her Grace, for the quality that had made all of this possible. Grace for the moment when she had heard a whisper in a crowd and chosen to follow it. Grace for the stepfather who had stepped aside to let a ghost reclaim his place. Grace for the husband who had welcomed chaos into what should have been the perfect day. Grace for the father who had found the courage to return after decades of believing he had no right to. David held his granddaughter in the hospital room, this tiny miracle wrapped in pink blankets, and he sang to her the same lullaby he had sung to her mother 33 years before. Hush now, my darling, the stars hold you tight. Daddy will find you by morning's first light. Margaret watched from her hospital bed, James beside her holding her hand, and she felt the circle finally close. The promise that had been broken on a battlefield half a world away had been kept at last. Not in the way anyone had expected, not without cost or complication or pain, but kept nonetheless, in a garden full of roses, at a wedding that stopped for a whisper, in a family that had been torn apart by war and put back together by love. There are fathers who never come home. There are children who grow up with empty chairs at dinner tables and unanswered questions in their hearts. There are families fractured by war, by circumstance, by the impossible choices that survival sometimes demands. David Chen was supposed to be one of the lost ones. He was supposed to be a name on a wall, a folded flag in a shadow box, a memory that faded a little more with each passing year. Instead, he became something rarer, a ghost who found his way back, a father who returned to a daughter who had never stopped listening for his voice. The next time you hear an old song that stirs something in your memory, pay attention. The next time you see someone at the edge of a crowd who does not seem to belong, look closer. The people we have lost are sometimes closer than we know. And love, real love, the kind that is written into our bones and carried in our hearts, never truly dies. It only waits, patient and faithful, for the moment when it can finally come home. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that family is stronger than time, and that some bonds cannot be broken by any distance or any years.